Have you ever wondered how generations navigated the years when Google didn't exist and computers didn't exist and all these modern technologies that are on today didn't exist? And what people did when they had to make do with the equipment and everything that they had at their disposal. I'm going back into, say, like the 1950s and 60s and even before that sort of time. This video just talks a little bit about what some of the products were like back in the 1950s and 60s, how people survived, how people adapted, how we became a sort of, if something breaks, you've got to fix it rather than just throwing it out the window and getting a new one. And just some of the time-tested coping mechanisms that were invaluable in our time back in the 50s and 60s and onwards into the 70s and so on from there, and how we adapted to all the challenges that came our way. As I look at all the technology that exists today, whether it be in the home or in the workplace or on the farm or wherever, it takes me back to a time back in my childhood in the 50s and 60s when I think about some of the equipment that we had at the time and how it worked in our lives. The first thing I think about when I go back to when I first started school, I remember just as a little kid having these school desks with an inkwell in the corner. And I remember we had little pens that you had to dip into an inkwell and then write with them. I know that sounds really prehistoric, but I remember it. And I also remember that you'd have a turn of being the ink monitor for the week. Now, if I recall, I think the ink used to come in a powdered form, and you'd take turns during the year of having a week as an inkwell monitor. And it was your job to, I don't know whether we mixed up the ink or the teachers mixed it up, but then you had to go around and fill everybody's little inkwell so that you could do your dippy pen and write on the paper. And it horrifies me actually to think about. I do remember that's one of my first recollections in school. But I do remember that when we were in school, you always had to use pencils. It was the old HB pencils. And that was what you used to learn to write with. And you'd do, I guess, I don't know, your first couple of years or what, I'm not sure. You'd be using these, always have to use a pencil to do learning to write your alphabet and your numbers and all of that sort of thing. And I remember as you graduated into being able to use a pen, to use ink, we had these dip pens that I think you dip them into the inkwell and you write a little bit until the ink runs out and then you dip it in again. And then there was a progression where fountain pens became available. Now, of course, everyone knows that a fountain pen's got a little cylinder thing in it where you can fill it up with ink and it lasts you quite a bit longer until the ink runs out and then you can fill it up again. My camera just had a little dive and just put it back together again. Yes, and then you would graduate to these fountain pens. And these were amazing because at that stage then I think we did away with the inkwells, and people would get these little bottles of ink. You could buy them from the bookshop and you had your own little bottle of ink and you'd dip your pen, fill it up, and that would keep you going for a few days until it ran out again. But of course it wasn't till many years, what seemed many years, it probably wasn't that many, before ballpoint pens become in, but they were an absolute no-no. We weren't allowed to use these highfalutin ballpoint pen thingies that had come out. We had to still keep using fountain pens, and that was quite some time until it was acceptable to start using ballpoint pens. And of course the glory of that then is that you could get ballpoint pens in lots of different, you get 4 different colours. You'd get the standard blue, and then you'd get black, green and red. So that was quite an amazing advancement, being able to use ballpoint pens and being able to get them in 4 different colours. And then I think as I moved into high school, I took a commercial course where one of the things that I wanted to learn was shorthand and typing. And you would go into the typing room, and we'd have these just typing classes, and you would go into a typing room and every desk would have one of these high typewriters on it with its little cover, and you'd lift the cover off and everyone would have to sit down and plink and plink and plink away at these typewriters. And I went through all my schooling, many years of work using one of these manual typewriters. And you could start getting, I'm not quite sure, can't really recall what happened with the automated typewriters, but you'd be able to do a couple of lines and then edit it and then print it. I can't remember. That's just, my memory's a bit vague on those. But that was prior to computers coming in. And of course then once computers came in, it was just amazing that you could type and edit everything and do up a whole document and print the whole thing out at the end. And that was just such an amazing advancement to get into the computer age. Now I'm only talking here late sort of 80s and early 90s. It really wasn't that long ago, not in the great scheme of things, considering at that stage, I was sort of 40 and still living in the land of the manual typewriters. So the introduction of computers has just been so amazing. And people living now, that have been born since that time, probably can't even imagine what life was like without having a computer to do all your typing and things. And of course, typing too was only it was only girls. It was only girls at school that did typing. And then I remember a friend of mine used to work I think she was at a newspaper, and they had the guys that used to set the print for the newspapers. And of course, most of those staff in those days, it was all men, can't remember what they were called. And then as computer age come in, it was all typed out electronically. And I remember there being a big to-do about the guys that had the previous jobs couldn't type. And so they had a big panic on trying to learn how to type so that they could do their job on a computer. But a lot of the women could just get straight into it because they had typing skills. And I remember there was a big carry-on for a while, or my friend told me about this, where they weren't prepared to pay the woman the same amount of money to do this job where they had the skills already to do the typing of the pages, the news pages and everything like that. But they were sort of responsible for teaching the men how to type so that they could do the job and get their normal wages, but they wouldn't pay the woman the same sort of wages. And I mean, it just horrifies me to think about it, but that's a fact, that's what happened. So that was all, sort of a bit of yes, it wouldn't go down very well these days, would it? Now, I remember too that the first year that I started high school, I think that was in 1964, Mum and Dad bought their first TV set. But I think TV first started broadcasting in New Zealand, I think in 1960. I believe it was the 1st of June 1960, my research tells me. But we got our first TV, which was the old black and white, the big cabinety thing. And it was all black and white, and we got our first television set. And I think at that stage, I think the TV, it would start broadcasting about 6 o'clock at night and it would go till about 10 or 11 o'clock. But earlier, I think, the earlier times prior to me, or at the time in 64 when we got a TV, I think the first broadcasts were only for about 3 hours a day. But that sort of increased as time went by. But yes, I remember when we got our first TV, I think the broadcast would start maybe 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and that would be with the news, and then you'd have a couple of programs and get Bonanza and whatever, and then you'd have closed down at 10 o'clock or 10:30, 11 o'clock or something like that. And then I know in 74, it was when the Commonwealth Games were on here in New Zealand. I was married by this time, and we decided to get our first TV, colour TV. And it was only a rental at that stage, and it was just on the 4 legs and just a little TV screen box shape type thing. So yeah, that was when I remember we had our first colour TV, and I don't remember when colour TV was first introduced to New Zealand, but that was when I remember my husband and I first got our colour TV. Of course now they're not even a box or anything, they're just a screen, and so it goes on. We all know what modern TVs are like now. They can cover half your wall and be about 1/4 of an inch thick. So yes, times have changed. And then also when we first got married, I got married in 1969. I was 18 at the time, and our first lawnmower was a push mower, and used to have to push these things around the lawn to cut the grass, and it was quite a number of years before we bought our motor mower to do the lawn mowing. But you just managed, you made do. And of course, with any of these things that we had, it didn't matter what it was. If anything ever broke down, you either learned how to fix it or you got the repair guy in to fix it. It wasn't a throwaway economy like it is today. I mean, I remember so many times you'd have a toaster and one of the elements inside would go. You'd take it down to the electrician, or you'd go to the electrician and buy a new element and put it in, and you'd fix your toaster. You were ready to go again for another another couple of years or so. Of course, if you had two elements in it, you had to change them both, because if you didn't, one was sort of older and it didn't have the strength in it as the newer one did. So that would cook things faster, but then your other side of your toast or your other piece of toast wouldn't cook very well. So if you ever had to replace your elements in your toaster, you'd have to do both of them or whatever. You couldn't just do one, you had to do them both. And then, of course, there was when we got married too, I remember we had our washing machine. It was one of those ringer washing machines, and it was just a big barrel, and it had the ringer over the top, and it was all manual. You'd put the washing in, and then you'd let it agitate for as long as you wanted to, and then you'd come in and you'd turn off the agitator, and then you'd push it all through the rollers, which all the clothes would go through the roller and squeeze water out of it. So that would go into a tub of cold water. You'd rinse it all around, and then you'd roll it back again through the rollers before you put it into your basket and took it out and hung it on the line. Never ever had anything like a clothes dryer. Everything was, all our clothes were always dried on the clothesline outside. And you'd get a wooden clothes horse, which was a bit of a contraption thing you'd set up inside. Just if you couldn't get your washing properly dry or you wanted to air it, you just draped it all over this clothes horse and left it in the warmest room of your house so that the clothing would air out. So for me, I had this machine for years. It was a long time before I sort of was able to invest in an automatic washing machine. Of course, now you have your automatic washing machines, you have your dryers, and it's just, everything's just come so far ahead. But it was, people managed, people persevered. When you didn't have all of these things, the work, of course, was very manual. You had to put effort, and sometimes if it was a push mower, you had to put a lot of energy into it. But you just did it because that's all there was. There was nothing else. I mean, you look at the old push mowers, and you go through the stages to having you get a motor mower. That's great, you get a motor mower, and then people get ride-on mowers, so you're riding on them around the lawn. Now they're all done by robots. Get this thing, you set it out up on your lawn, and you turn it on, and away it goes, and it mows your lawn for you. So I think if people that were alive in the 50s and 60s when they were older, if they could see the way things are right now, they'd probably shake their head and think, oh gosh, how did we get to this stage? But anyway, that was just how things were back then. And I've been lucky that I've been able to go right through. We're probably one of the only generations, the baby boomers are probably one of the only generations that can go back to the times of dipping your pens into an inkwell and old manual typewriters, right up now to the modern technology there is today. And I sort of wonder about, the different generations, what it's going to be like when they had their life and what it's going to be like when they're in their 70s, the same as I am now. But I think I was probably fortunate that I was able to journey through that really changing technological era, and I can't really see it's going to be the same for a good long time. I think the introduction of AI is going to be something altogether new. Probably in a few years' time, people are going to be saying they can't imagine what life was like without AI. And of course, those people will have their own stories to tell. So, yeah, so that's really, the theme of the whole thing is that even though technology has advanced, it's also made it easier for people physically and even financially. People think, at the moment that life is hard, it's, money is short and all this sort of thing. But when you think about when I think about what it was like trying to buy equipment and machinery and things for the house and all that sort of stuff, you'd buy one item and you'd get it on hire purchase because you never ever had the money just to go out and pay cash for anything. You'd put it onto hire purchase for 12 months, and then when that one was paid off, then you'd look at what else you're going to buy. And whereas now, just go into walk into the shops and hand over the money and walk out with a nice big TV, and it's just such a big change over those decades. And it just really shows that it's, we've had to cope not with the increase of technology so much, but how it's changed our lives so much. And I have to agree it's for the better, but I do miss at times the times that I used to feel, it used to be an achievement if something broke down, you could fix it and you were able to fix it. Whereas now it's basically just out of the question. Once something breaks down, it's no good anymore. You chuck it out and you've got to go and buy a new one. So that's just, how I've been talking about the way things used to be and through that time of what they're like now. So yeah, who knows what life's going to be like in the next 20, 30, 40 years. I wish I was going to be here to be able to see it, but I doubt very much whether I'll live till 110, so that'll be someone else's story to tell. Okay, thank you for listening. My name is June. This is the first time you've been here. Welcome. If you've returned once again, welcome back. And I will wish you all a happy day, happy weekend. Hope everyone stays safe and just take care. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.